Today we're going to be talking about the Enlightenment and some important social changes that occurred during the Enlightenment. Here are your video goals. Let's begin by talking about how the Enlightenment spread from the center of Western Europe to the fringes of European civilization. The Enlightenment began as a movement centered in the metropolitan areas of London, Paris, and Amsterdam. These three cities were the center of world trade and of European culture around 1700. But as the Enlightenment progressed, it spread throughout European civilization to less metropolitan areas such as Scotland, North America, and Germany. In Scotland, there were two important thinkers that basically reached Europe-wide fame because of their writings. One was David Hume, who was an important philosopher, and he argued against organized religion. He advanced a lot of arguments against organized religion. His most important claim was that reason could not demonstrate the truth of religious ideas, and therefore that people should not believe these ideas because people should only believe what could be founded on reason. Adam Smith, the other important Scottish thinker, was an economist, and he argued for free trade, sometimes known as laissez-faire or free market economics. Basically, what Smith argued was that fewer restrictions to trade would mean more wealth for everybody. So if governments just left people alone to do their business and to start businesses and to trade, there would be more trade and more business, and everybody would have more wealth. This idea became incredibly important, and Adam Smith is still viewed as an important thinker today in free market economies, like the United States. In the United States, or the future United States, really North America at this point, there were two leading figures that became famous not only in North America but also in Europe. One was Thomas Jefferson, and he was well known for criticizing traditional religion, much like David Hume. He even once created his own abbreviated Bible called the Jefferson Bible, where he cut out all of the things that he believed were false, and he was left with only a few small chapters of things that he actually believed were true about the Bible. And he also used ideas from the Enlightenment, most specifically Locke's ideas from the Enlightenment, to justify the American Revolution, which began in the 1770s. The other famous American was Benjamin Franklin, and he was famous, one, as a scientist because he advanced the scientific understanding of electricity, along with many other things, and he also supported public education and the expansion of government into the public sphere, setting up things like libraries and post offices and fire departments and stuff like that. So he was an advocate for rational government. And finally, in Germany, there was one major figure that was really important throughout Europe, and his name was Immanuel Kant. And he argued for reforms in government that would eliminate warfare and bring about perpetual peace in Europe. Of course, his ideas didn't really catch on there. He also tried to place science on a solid philosophical foundation to figure out exactly how it was that science worked. And he also tried to figure out what the limits of critical thought and reason actually were. So he came around towards the end of the Enlightenment, and he started to doubt the central idea of the Enlightenment, that reason could solve every problem. So as the Enlightenment was spreading out throughout Europe, there was an interesting thing going on in European society. And this was the result of increasing world trade and increasing urbanization. And the reason that increasing urbanization and increasing world trade was going on was largely the fact that Europe was expanding its colonial empire, increasing the production of luxury products on plantations such as coffee and sugar and tobacco, and on the back of all of this, increasing its dependence on slave labor. And the slave trade actually reaches its highest historical peak during the 1700s, during the Enlightenment, which is a huge contradiction to the basic values of Enlightenment thinkers. But so anyway, all of this, the growth of trade and the growth of colonialization and everything, leads to the rise of a new social elite, basically a new powerful social group. And this group is known as the bourgeoisie. The bourgeoisie could be defined as wealthy city dwellers who made their money either through trade, through business, or through some service-based profession, people like doctors and lawyers. Bourgeoisie is a French word. It basically means people who live in cities. But so anyway, the bourgeoisie are becoming more and more powerful as world trade becomes more and more important in national economies. And because they become more powerful, they start to assert themselves and to compete with traditional European elites for power and privilege. The traditional elites are the members of the church and of the landowning aristocracy. And so you can see there, here's a little model of European society. So most people remain in the lower classes. These are peasants and urban laborers. But about maybe 10% of European society fell into either the traditional elites, the church and the aristocracy, or the new elites, aka the bourgeoisie. And these two elites conflicted with each other because they were competing for control in their respective countries. But so the Enlightenment can be viewed as an expression of bourgeois attempts to take over control in their respective nations. The Enlightenment was basically grew out of the bourgeoisie, and most Enlightenment ideas supported the values and the interests of bourgeois groups. Look a little bit more into the competition between the bourgeoisie and the aristocracy. So traditionally, basically from the Middle Ages onward, Europe had been dominated by wealthy rural nobles, people who owned land and owned peasants and basically were urban farming tycoons. These guys could be called the aristocracy. And these guys, because they had for a long time been the basis of the nation's wealth and military power, were accustomed to certain privileges, special access to government jobs, exemptions from certain taxes, and other stuff as well. And this continued into the Enlightenment, even though the aristocracy had lost a lot of its real power. For example, in France, they had demolished all of the nobles' castles, and the nobles were no longer in charge of leading their own little private armies like in the Middle Ages, but the nobles still kept a lot of their privileges. They still didn't have to pay many taxes, and they still got to do all sorts of fancy special things that other people, commoners, quote unquote, could not do. But so the growing bourgeoisie didn't really like this, right? They demanded increasing equality with the aristocracy. And the reason they demanded this is because they believed that they, as the people who ran cities and ran world trade and growing industrialization and stuff like that, they argued that they were now the foundation of the nation's strength and that they should be given more privileges and that the aristocracy that was becoming less important should have fewer privileges. The Enlightenment tended to promote this idea and to further the interests of the bourgeoisie. For example, representative government was popular among the bourgeoisie because this would give the bourgeoisie a say in creating laws. They were also for human rights because human rights would protect the bourgeoisie from the interference of the government and from meddling nobles. And they also supported free market economics because this would benefit bourgeois traders and manufacturers who were kind of the new wave of doing things over old protected interest groups like medieval guilds or royal monopolies. They thought that this would give them the edge over these older groups. But so not surprisingly, nobles oppose most Enlightenment reforms. And the main reason for this is that they're worried that the Enlightenment would take away their traditional powers and privileges and that they would stop to exist as an elite class. But so the Enlightenment reforms do go into effect in a lot of countries, and the reason for this is because of war. The 18th century was, as usual in Europe, an era of warfare. And this war was becoming more destructive and more expensive because of advancing technologies. Now, instead of kind of simple warfare led by feudal armies that support themselves, the European nations are fighting enormous wars with professional soldiers using advanced weapons like cannons and muskets, and this is incredibly expensive. On top of this, warfare, it becomes global. Because of colonialism, when war breaks out, the war happens not only in Europe, but all around the world, in the American colonies, in Asia, and on the high seas. And so these global conflicts are incredibly complicated and incredibly expensive. And what this means is that governments must increase their income and efficiency, otherwise they will start to lose these wars and they will cease to exist as independent nations. And this means that most countries, at least the leading countries in Europe, begin to advance Enlightenment reforms. They enact economic reforms to increase trade, increase tax revenue, and to increase agricultural production. They institute educational reforms in hopes of increasing individual productivity and making better officers for armies and bureaucrats for the government. And they introduce legal reforms to simplify outdated legal systems and to take into account new things that were going on, like world trade. This happens even in countries that are dominated by old-fashioned absolutist rulers, leading to the phenomenon of enlightened absolutism. This happens in Austria under the Queen Maria Theresa, in Prussia under Frederick the Great, and in Russia under Catherine the Great. The bourgeoisie, of course, is happy about this and they support these reforms. But the aristocracy resists these reforms. And this sets the stage for conflict in these different countries as the bourgeoisie and the aristocracy push and pull, trying to implement new governmental reforms that came out of Enlightenment thought. And in the next chapter, when we talk about the French Revolution, we're going to see how this plays out in Europe's most powerful country, France. Here are your goals again. I hope you understood everything. If you didn't, write down questions and ask me in class tomorrow.